can we get into the topic of seed oil? Do you mind if I take a moment to pass out a graph that's been going around in regards to the relation of saturated fats, red meat, type 2 diabetes, and seed oils? So it shows that over time, what we've noticed, we've had a spike in type 2 diabetes and prediabetes. This is a percentage of people in the United States. And right along with that spike, we have an increase in, we have a spike in seed oils. And then right along with that spike, we have a spike of type 2 diabetes and prediabetes. And they looked at saturated fat during that time, which stayed pretty level. They looked at carbs, including sugars. That stayed pretty level too. And then also red meat. That stayed pretty level. So what are your initial thoughts on a graph like this?
So my initial thoughts, if I wasn't a scientist, would be, holy moly, look at this increase in seed oil.
It's clear. It's right there.
And this increase in diabetes. I mean, shit, we've got to stop eating seed oils.
Yeah, but
now you interpret
as
it
an
as an
epidemiologist.
But by the way, can I just caveat? Sorry, that's not my real interpretation.
Oh, okay, all right. That was just your ploy to be able to come back to the United States. Got it. Okay.
Yeah, this is the sort of epidemiology 101. You know, you get some graphs, you correlate deaths or amount of disease against other things that are going up or down, and you draw a conclusion from that. And this is essentially the crudest of observational epidemiology. Mm-hmm. And I actually did this, my first ever paper I wrote was about coffee drinking and cancer of the pancreas. Mm-hmm. I got the data, and there was a clear correlation between coffee drinking and cancer of the pancreas. And in every country I looked at. And it was completely flawed. I got it in the Lancet, so I didn't mind. But it was it was a brilliant example of correlation, not causation. Mm-hmm. And this particular graph, you could equally say, well, it's related to Netflix subscriptions. Right. Is actually probably a tighter one than seed oils. So we should be banning Netflix, mm-hmm. or listening to podcasts, or other deadly pursuits. It's meaningless, really, because there's so many things you could correlate it with, and it means nothing. If just two trends are going up, it's the worst kind of evidence, really, which we don't use in epidemiology anymore, unless it's a really unusual trait, for mm-hmm. example, which might start a series of experiments which would then eventually lead to deciding whether there was any truth in this in a more logical way. But you could come up with 100 different hypotheses about every single food that's gone up or down. And I see ultra-processed foods not in there.
It's not, no. Carbs are.
But again, it's this reductionist idea that everything is a macro, we're down to these macro things, these very large groups of foods, rather than, the holistic ideas, the fact that everything's on the plate, all the thousands, we think there's, perhaps 100,000 different chemicals in food, and we're sort of reducing this down to, mindless levels of reductionism, mm-hmm. and usually blaming one thing. Okay? Mm-hmm. So someone could do a graph and say, okay, gluten's going up. Mm-hmm. Let's look at lectins. Whatever the latest social media trend is, you can have a correlation for it. And if you publish it, you do 100 of them, you find 5 of them that are significant, and you publish that, and that's your new theory, and you write a best-selling book, and you have a blog on it, and you go crazy on social media. Yeah. But it's complete nonsense.
So what's the alternative to running? In this case, it's not even an inter-individual correlation, looking at the incidence of something related to the intake of another thing. This is just showing two things in a population are going up at the same time. What's the better way to study that? How would you design a study, and what is the evidence?
So if we wanted to look at the relationship between seed oils and type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, which social media, or according to social media, seed oils are causing all of those things, then really you'd want to do what is the gold standard in nutrition science, which is a randomized control trial where you would recruit a representative cross-section of people of different ages, sexes, etc., different background dietary intakes, and then you would randomly allocate half of the group to increase their seed oils to a certain level. Typically, we would select a level that's at what we call a 95th percentile of intake, meaning it's higher than the typical person would have, but it's still possible within our food landscape. And then we would ask other people to limit their seed oil intake, and we would ask them to have the same level of fat, but from a different source, whether it be butter, whether it be olive oil, etc. But so that in an ideal world, they're also used in the same functional way, because this is really, really important, that when we're doing nutrition research, it's really important to think, well, how is that ingredient or food used? There's no point comparing seed oil, for example, to coffee. If you don't use seed oil, well, hopefully you're not using it in your coffee, but who knows? You want to compare it to something that is used in the same functional way. I know, I was thinking
the same thing. Butter.
Okay, not coffee, something else. And then you would take measures before people start to change their diet. So you look at all different measures you're interested in, whether it be inflammation, other kind of type 2 diabetes markers, fasting glucose, insulin, cholesterol, lipids. You might do, physical examinations. I do a lot of work looking at blood vessel function using ultrasound, etc. And then over a certain period of time, you would do repeated measures. You change their diet maybe for 12 weeks, probably not more than that because it's quite difficult. You then lose compliance. And then once people aren't complying, it actually muddies the data more than actually going for a longer period of time. And then you look at the changes in these outcomes. You compare your control arm to your intervention arm, where the intervention in this case would be seed oils, and you look at what the difference is. And this has been done. This has been done lots and lots and lots of times with seed oils, which is why we don't need to look at those graphs.
Tell us about the meta-analysis. I know there's a meta-analysis out there, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many studies, and I think it's important before we kind of dive into that with seed oils to say, to acknowledge that actually 60% of the seed oils that we consume typically in the UK and US, it's about 60%, is in the form of ultra-processed food. So it is important to acknowledge that whilst the evidence is, I think, quite robust in showing that seed oils are not harmful for health, they are now being consumed in foods that have other ingredients and have gone through other processes that are harmful for health. So I do think it's important to caveat with that. There have been many randomized controlled trials that are then all put together into what we call meta-analysis, and they consistently show that there's no negative impact of seed oils on our health, that if anything, they actually improve our health. And these are studies where they're not looking cross-sectionally at a population, like what's your seed oil intake, and if you've got a higher seed oil intake, how is that associated with X, Y, and Z compared to those not consuming much? Because that's tricky given that most of it comes from ultra-processed food. But these are studies, like I just described, where people are randomly allocated to have a high seed oil intake versus a control. They show lower levels of blood cholesterol, particularly LDL cholesterol, which is our bad cholesterol, because they're really high in a particular fatty acid called omega-6. They tend to, when inflammation has been looked at, they tend to show a reduction in inflammation as well, an improvement in lots and lots of different factors related to cardiovascular disease. And what's interesting is that the omega-6, which is the main fatty acid in many seed oils, or one of the important fatty acids in many seed oils, the seed oil haters out there often use the omega-6 fatty acids as being called, they're the culprit, they say. And that's based on these theoretical pathways where omega-6 fatty acids in the body can be modified to produce a particular type of very, very long chain omega-6 fatty acid that when there's appropriate stimuli can release inflammatory factors, can release factors related to blood clotting, etc.
Wow.
We have to have inflammation. We have to, our blood has to clot. If I was to go and get really mad with Tim one day and cut his finger or something.
Wow.
I'm joking, I'd never do that.
Upset.
No, but if we were to cut our finger, we need to clot.
Yeah.
We need to have a local inflammation to heal. And so we need to be able to have that inflammatory and clotting response. And our bodies are so clever in knowing when to turn it on and when to turn it off.
Yep.
But there is this argument that because downstream you get this inflammatory response from...
And inflammation's all bad.
Yep, which if it's in the wrong place at the wrong time,
Sure.
you know, and for too long, yes,
Yeah, right.
it is. But we need that. It's part of a normal physiological process. And what the evidence really clearly shows is when people are put on high omega-6 diets, typically through seed oils, that you do not get an increase in inflammation. You do not get an increase in these particular chemicals that we know are precursors to these inflammatory mediators. And so we can myth bust the fact that this theoretical pathway that people talk about, that doesn't play out in humans. We're so clever. We don't, you know, we don't just churn out all these inflammatory mediators because we're eating seed oils. And then also, you know, the other arguments that people use, like these correlation, you know, every argument that's used by the seed oils are toxic people, we have really clear evidence to show that that's not the case.
Has there been a change in the manufacturing of seed oils? Because, you know, putting on my non-MD hat, I see things coming across like these are byproducts of industrial processes and they're just reusing it to save money for, you know, and putting it in all your food. And certainly that sounds very, you know, troubling. But I'm wondering if you know anything in regards to the manufacturing of seed oils.
So there are some people that say, oh my gosh, these were used as engine lubricants,
Right, yeah.
so why should we put it in our body? Well, actually, there was a really interesting Instagram post that came out yesterday by this guy called Dr. Ids, who debunked some of that. And he had some fabulous data back from about 300 years ago showing that beef tallow, and I know in America, there's potentially a move from seed oils to beef tallow, that beef tallow and lard was used as an engine lubricant as well. So God forbid we eat beef tallow or lard.
Olive oil is used to, you know, wash people's hair in grease. So does that mean you know?
So should you, you know,
yeah.
I put shea butter on my face as part of my cream.
Right,
So
right.
God forbid I was to ever eat that.
Right, yeah.
Which actually is a healthy fat as well, shea butter.
Yeah.
But by the
delicious.
by.
Yeah.
And so if you look back in history, so many components of the foods that we eat have been used for other
Multiple
processes.
uses,
So I think that's nonsense as well.
Except that it's going with low quality foods. So it's part of this ultra processed food.
Yes.
If it's used more and more in ultra processed foods, which are
Yeah.
low, cheap quality, they're cutting corners all the time, then other health problems are going to creep into that mixture.
Right.
But I think what you're saying is not the actual oil itself.
Yes.
But it's the whole ultra processing is more like to be the problem. So don't demonize the oil, but
Right.
demonize ultra processed foods.
But I think lots of people demonize the processes that the oil goes through as
Right,
well. So
right.
when you want to get oil from a seed, you can do it a number of different ways. One is you can just cold press it. So literally you squeeze it and the oil comes out. Now that's really not a very productive way of getting...
That's like olive. That's how you get high quality olive oil.
But you only get about 40 to 50% of the oil. The rest of it's kind of left, you know, in amongst the kind of plant cell walls, etc., etc. And so it's a very expensive way, therefore, of extracting the oil. It also means the oil is often quite unstable because there's lots of components in oil once it's taken out of the plant matrix, which means it might oxidize more, etc. So this is why most oils are refined, and by refined I mean they use different processes to extract it from the seed to maximise the output. And so what they'll do is once they've pressed it, then they'll use solvents like hexane, which kind of dissolves the oil out, so they're getting all of the oil out. Then they clean up the oil, so they get rid of lots of the kind of volatile components which we know will degrade the oil really quickly. And they use different processes, but the words that are used to describe it, I think, often sound quite scary. And you see these a lot used in social media, like it's bleached, it's deodorized, it's, you know, all of these different, and then they throw these different chemical names out. Good oil manufacturers now use processes in such a kind of rigorous way, making sure that there is almost no trace of any of the components that they use to put these seed oils through this refinement process. And the end product is a stable product. It might have slightly less of some of the bioactives like polyphenols compared to the cold pressed, but in other respects it has a lot more of the fat soluble components. So things like vitamin E, for example, is really high in these oils. I would like to just caveat that I have never received any funding from the seed oil industry. I don't get paid by the seed oil industry. I have never had a paycheck from the seed oil industry. I have spoken quite vocally in support for the evidence, which I think the totality of the evidence shows that seed oils are healthy. But I have had thousands of comments on Instagram saying I'm an industry shill and I'm being paid by the seed oil industry. If I am, I want to know where that paycheck's going, because I could be sitting somewhere in the Mediterranean on a luxury yacht, because I've not got it.
In one of the blue zones. All right, let's move on to let's move past the seed oil thing. I think
So it's safe to say you're not going to be wearing a shirt to bring beef tallow back again.
No, and there's even been studies looking at seed oils versus beef tallow.
Okay, because we got you on, guys. Can you? Just kidding.
No.
No, you're not going to be wearing one. Okay.
So what would you rather? So you're not a big fan of beef tallow?
No, so beef tallow is essentially the same as butter, which, you know, in small amounts it's fine. It's not going to do us any harm. But beef tallow is really high in saturated fat. It's high in the types of saturated fat that we know increase the risk of cardiovascular disease through effects on cholesterol, effects on inflammation.
So it's like cooking everything in butter.
Pretty much, yeah.
Rather than
I mean,
just
there's
having a butter occasionally on a bit of
yeah,
bread.
it's slightly different, but pretty much.